Hey, everybody. If you're like me, you're still reeling from the midterm elections and have, questions and like, did that really happen? And how did that happen? And what happened? Well, I've got the perfect person to unpack it all with, and that's my buddy, Simon Rosenberg, president of NDN, New Democrat Network, and the New Policy Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Simon has been present about his assessment of this election from the very beginning. You may recall we had a conversation back in September where we were both standing there saying, hey, Democrats could actually wind up holding the House this November. Everybody laughing at us and calling us crazy. Well, not so crazy now. Red wave much? Not really. You might also know him as one of the few strategists who said that there would be no red wave this November. So if anyone is deserving of an I told you so, guess what? It's my friend, Simon. We had Simon on the podcast, as I said a couple of months ago. It was a great treat then. It's going to be an even better treat for you now because for the first time, he's laying out a full assessment of what happened on November 8th. You'll get to hear it right here on the Michael Steele podcast right after this. Well, everybody, like I said, if you didn't listen to the conversation in September when Simon and I sort of unpacked our thinking around what was going to happen, you damn sure will appreciate the conversation today because now we're going to connect that dot for you in a big way. Simon, welcome back to the podcast, babe. It's so good to see you, man.
It's great to be here, and democracy had a good week this week.
Democracy had a good week, and that is an appropriate way to begin the conversation because I do want to thank everyone, especially our Gen Z community of young voters who voted, participated. Don't tell me your vote doesn't make a difference. It does. It does in ways you can only appreciate when you see a night like we saw on Tuesday night. So let's just, before we get into the nitty gritty, because there's a lot of nitty gritty to get into, say first off, votes are still being counted in Arizona, Nevada for the U.S. Senate. Georgia's now going into a runoff between Herschel and Walker and Warnock. The House is still unsettled. Dems have a 220 seat, Republicans have a 222 seat majority with 7 seats by NBC analysis still to be decided. So their majority can grow to 229, which is well below the 60 seat majority they were claiming at certain points that they may have. Very narrow majority regardless in the House for Republicans. The Senate, again, still in play. What's your top line view of what happened on Tuesday and why it happened the way it did?
Well, it's really, as I've tried to sort of figure this all out, right, and come to my own understanding, I think the most important thing I can tell your community is that the media kind of ignored all of the evidence that Democrats had heightened intensity. And so let's just go through this. And my colleague Tom Bondier and I have been collaborating in sort of the argument I'm about to make. And I apologize, I'm still a little tired.
Yeah, just so you know, folks, both of us are probably working on about a combined 6 hours of sleep.
So what I'd say is this, is that we saw, when we spoke in September, what we talked about was we saw this heightened Democratic intensity after Dobbs. We saw it in the 5 House specials where Democrats overperformed their 2020 numbers by 7 points. We saw it in Kansas. We saw it in heightened voter registration. And we saw it in far superior candidate fundraising, which is a sign of intensity and strength, right? And what you and I discussed in September was that it was my view then that the biggest question in the election was, would that Democratic intensity carry over to the election? And what we saw in the early vote was that it was. And so Tom Bondier and I were out every day saying, hey, everybody better pay attention to what's going on here, because There's a very, the vote is higher than it was in 2018, which I don't think anybody expected, because 2018 was a record midterm election. So more people were voting, sign of incredible intensity. And Democrats were winning the early vote by 50 to 39, whereas we only won it by 7 points in 2020. So we were doing 4 points better
Right.
in 2020, similar to the 7 points better in the House special elections. And so Tom and I were ringing the alarm that, hey, this basic pattern that we had seen since June of heightened Democratic intensity, Republicans underperforming, right? Because remember, they underperformed in the 4 House specials, they underperformed in Kansas, the voter reg numbers dropped off, and their candidates didn't raise any money. So we were checking all the intensity boxes. They weren't checking any of them. And we argued that, maybe the red wave was going to come, but it wasn't here yet. And as we had weeks of data in the early vote, it was pretty clear that the Republicans were having turnout problems in the election, and that we were actually heading into election day. And what I said was in my final memo on Monday was, I'd rather be us than them, based on data. And that's what happened. I mean, that in essence, the Democrats overperformed expectations. Republicans continued this pattern of underperformance. And I think, Michael, as you know better than anybody, what's happening is that there is a big chunk. I mean, there's an anti-MAGA majority in the country, but I also think there were a lot of Republicans who just couldn't go there.
Yep.
They just couldn't, at the end of the day, they looked at the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party, the Michael Steele, Liz Cheney wing of the Republican Party, and all, whether it's 8%, 10% of the electorate or whatever it is, there's just too many of them were like, I'm just not going to go there. Or this abortion thing it's just gone too far. This is too much, right? And that's why I think Republicans had intensity problems, was that the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party just wasn't bringing everybody along. And so I think that this is a really, and for those of you who have fought so valiantly, so bravely, so courageously to fight the MAGA takeover of your party, this was a good election, because I think MAGA's now had its 3rd consecutive disappointing election. Donald Trump even described this election as disappointing, which is kind of shocking, right?
Yep.
And so I hope now that you and Liz and Bill Kristol and all of you who have fought to prevent this takeover of your party are emboldened now, that you're strengthened in that fight. And that I don't know that, right? But I'm hoping that that's what happens, and that the grip of MAGA has been a little bit loosened. Because and let me just say, because what's clear now, Michael, the final thing is that MAGA is a loser for the Republican Party. It's 3 consecutive elections where there's been underperformance. And if they underperform in an election like this, with 8.5% inflation, Biden at 43%, right? All the midterm dynamics, then my God, I mean, this election was given to the Republicans on a silver platter. But because MAGA is a diseased, crazy manifestation of our politics, it just can't perform for the Republicans. And so my hope is that all this incredibly courageous and brave work you've done, Michael, Mr. Chairman, that all of you now will be able to hopefully get a window to try to fight inside the Republicans to bring this back to a more conventional Western center-right party, which is what we need in this country.
Yeah, I believe that the will may be there in greater measure than it has been up to this point. I still, and unfortunately, we have to rely on our leaders inside the party to step into the moment and express as plainly and as clearly as you just did the state of the corpse.
Right.
Right. Since we like to do autopsies, let's do one right now, and in the moment, real time, where you can see the pathologies exposed that have created the kind of narrative where you're not losing for the sake of losing, you're losing profoundly in an environment in which, as you put it, we should be cleaning the clock and winning. I mean, there's no doubt about that. My fear is that leadership is not there. What will happen with a narrow majority in the House, whether the Dems stay at 217 and the Republicans go to 229, that's only a 12 seat majority. What does a Speaker McCarthy do with that? how does that translate when it comes to the very thing you said of
Right.
reorienting it towards Madisonian democratic principles that we purportedly believe in and espouse for generations? How does that narrative work? I think this electorate says a lot, and I give you. I mean, I want to get into some of the minutia, but here we go. Lindsey Graham, one of your lead tweets of the day, your pinned tweet, as a matter of fact, you lay out the thoughts about the election, the big miss, the third straight disappointing election, things you just touched on, and that was in response to Lindsey Graham on Fox talking to Mr. Waters on Fox. Question: what happened in Pennsylvania, Lindsey? Answer: early vote killed us. All right, well, okay. We can get into why you didn't play with early vote, because the leader of the party tells us that early voting is fraudulent. But again, missing the moment and the point to say with clarity, the early vote didn't kill us. Donald Trump and MAGA killed us.
Right. Yeah, look, Michael, I mean, I think you're going to have an interesting few months ahead of you, because you were joined by, thousands of Republican leaders all across the country who came out for Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, who came out for Cortez Masto in Nevada, who came out for Mark Kelly in Arizona, who came out for Democrats in Texas. This community of people fighting the takeover of MAGA has grown substantially during the course of this election, because up until this point, the question was, up until very recently, the question was, if Donald Trump lost, would the Republican Party kind of go back to its more traditional moorings? And what we learned is that that actually didn't happen. And so I think you saw an unprecedented national effort of Republican leaders all across the country breaking in a courageous and brave fashion from the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. And I think this dynamic is going to be really consequential in the coming months. And I think for Kevin McCarthy, the problem he's got, right, and what I'm about to say about this, is that he's not in control with 10 seats. He's not in control of his caucus. That means that MTG and all the very extreme elements now have veto power over everything that he's doing. This is a catastrophic development for him. I've always said that the worst possible outcome of this election for the Republican Party would be for us to keep the Senate and then have a single-digit margin in the House. Because Kevin McCarthy then, while MAGA was just rejected again for the third time, is going to be controlled and manipulated, and have lost control of his caucus to MAGA elements at a time after it's been repudiated again. And so I don't know what happens with Kevin McCarthy. I don't even know that he survives, the internal dynamics, because there will be a perception that he actually underperformed in the election, and there may be a more direct challenge to his leadership. We'll see. But this is, look, for the Supreme Court now, as they look ahead to what they're going to do this cycle, to what happens whether Mitch McConnell survives, now having had 2 consecutive disappointing elections in the Senate, because I think that Arizona and Nevada are both going to be called for the Democrats the next day or so, based on what we're seeing this morning.
I agree.
Is that, I think there's going to be incredible turmoil inside the Republican Party. I don't know how Ronna Romney McDaniel stays on. I mean, she has one of the worst track records of a party chairman in modern history.
Hello.
Hello. And so I think that this is going to be, I think there's going to be a very spirited debate. It's one of the reasons I wanted to be with you today in one of my first interviews after the election, because, it's important that you and Liz and Bill Cheney and everybody are successful. We need you to win this fight, Michael. And and so I'm just, I think you've got an opening here, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I don't know that Kevin McCarthy has the political skills and dexterity to manage what he's being given. And I think that he's got to be aware of that. Everyone's got to be aware of that around him, that this is not what they thought was going to happen. I mean, you saw what happened on Tuesday night. He had a victory party that he didn't show up for on national television. I mean, when have we ever seen anything like that, right? And this is why we have to remember that, the craziness of MAGA is not just ideological, it's also political. And as you said, it caused the Republicans to make an unbelievable tactical error in this election. And I actually wrote about this on Monday, saying if the Republicans don't have a good election, it could be largely because they downplayed the significance of the early vote. I mean, we went into election day with massive firewalls in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and so on. And what happened was the Washington Post had one of the most important political stories of the whole cycle on Monday. They were the only major news organization to report on this, which is they were able to go to Arizona and they got Republicans in Arizona to say on the record, we may have blown the election by not emphasizing the early vote. And this is where the election denialism and all of their anti-democracy, illiberal kind of nuttiness that Trump brought to the party was clearly, it wasn't just abortion that hurt the Republicans, it was this stuff too. Many of the most important election deniers in the country lost on Tuesday night. Not all of them, right? There are going to be a few
they're stragglers.
But listen, Michael, think about this. Not a single person has challenged the election results so far.
I know.
And what that means is I'm actually kind of stunned by this, to be frank. I mean, I expected there to be a chorus everywhere and it means that this whole election denialism crap that we've been hearing about over the last 2 years, the air has really come out of the balloon on that stuff in the last 2 days in a very profound way. And that's very encouraging for the country.
It was encapsulated for me in the media moment with Carrie Lake, who I absolutely have very little regard for, given how she has poisoned the electorate in Arizona, when she was complaining on early Tuesday, about irregularities and some concerns that she's hearing about and all this other stuff. So a reporter asked her, so if you win, are you going to challenge the election? Are you gonna take a moment and challenge the election? And she was like, well, I'm concerned about the people who are managing the process. I'm like, really? Oh, so you're not going to challenge the election if you win it, but you're setting up a narrative now that if you don't, that there are all these problems. And it really goes to what you said, that in the end, these candidates are looking at these campaigns and the way they've run them in one way, but then the reality hits them when the ballots are counted.
Yeah.
And they're seeing all of a sudden, oh, I'm not losing by 1 point, I'm losing by 10. Oh, okay, that's how this works.
So let me just sort of go on for a second about this other thing I've been chewing around that I'm still trying to process, is what happened in Michigan.
Yes.
And Michigan may be the most important story in the election and the most important story for the Republican Party, because we just not only, so in the early vote, which was about 35 to 45% of the vote, we'll see what the final number is, right? We just don't know yet. The early vote nationally, the early vote was about 4 points higher than the Democratic share, the Democratic performance was about 4 points higher than 2020 across the country. In Michigan, it was 22 points higher. Wow. I mean, just think about that statistic, right? I mean, wow. you do this for a living, right?
Yes.
I mean, we were, 13 points higher in Georgia. We were, 12 points higher in Pennsylvania. We were 13 points higher in Wisconsin, but we were 22 points higher in Michigan. There was a blue tsunami or a blue wave, right? And if you look what happened in Michigan, not only did Gretchen Whitmer win by 10 or 11 points, and we won all the statewide offices, but we flipped the House and Senate.
House and the Senate.
And because there was an abortion ballot initiative, and there was, again, this massive energy, not just of Democrats, by the way. This is where the Republican coalition is being weakened by both the extremism of the Republican Party, and now a second thing is weakening the Republican coalition, which is the abortion issue, as we saw in Kansas and as we've seen in places like Michigan. And so what it means for the Republican Party is that there could be years of pain coming on the abortion issue. Yep. And that 2024, there could be now, you could see Michigan, I'm sure that Democrats are going to try to put ballot initiatives in every state where we possibly can. And that, the Republican Party did something in 2022 that may not just have cost them to underperform in this election, but that could be a weight on them for many elections to come. And think about it, if you're a 30-year-old woman in this country, a 26-year-old man, and you know the Republicans did something so profound to sort of potentially disrupt the ability for you to manage your family, you know, the health of your wife as she ended up having a miscarriage, you know, what could possibly be more important than that? And the answer is the Republicans may have, you know, done enormous damage to their brand with child age bearing people for decades.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, to me, today, the most important story of this election is what happened in Michigan, the blue tsunami that we saw in Michigan. It was shocking, the election results there in a state that Joe Biden only won by 1 point. Gretchen Whitmer, a champion, a vigorous champion of choice in Michigan, won by 11 points against Ronna Romney McDaniels. By the way, this blue tsunami happened in the home state of the RNC chairperson.
Of the national chairwoman.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, right. So, you know, it's incredible.
It's profoundly important point to make, because what I think Michigan becomes a microcosm of, to your point about the abortion narrative, is in the past, prior to Dobbs, whether you were on, didn't matter which side of the battle you were on in terms of abortion, everyone was agreed around a fundamental bright line.
Right.
And that was rape, incest, life of the mother.
Right.
When you cross that line, as we've seen Republican legislators do, and now with Lindsey Graham lending his voice, which is why there was a massive eye roll and a audible, you know, groan from the Republican leadership when he goes out and pushes forward a bill to nationalize an anti-abortion position around rape, incest, life of the mother. Michigan happens. That's what happens. Kansas happens.
Right. Well, listen, I'll tell you, I just talked to a reporter this morning on the ground in Nevada, and she said Lindsey Graham cost the Republicans the election in Nevada. She said there's no question about it, because Nevada has a constitutional amendment enshrining abortion.
Yep.
But Cortez Masto was able to say that that doesn't matter if federal law overrides our amendment, right? So, you know, the Republicans are saying, oh, it doesn't. Laxalt, who, by the way, is an abortion extremist, is who crosses the line you're describing himself in his own politics, right? You know, they were saying in the early days, oh, no, it doesn't matter. It's enshrined in the Constitution. But I spoke to, you know, a major national reporter who's been on the ground in a network that you know very well.
Right.
On the ground, Natasha Korecki, who's an NBC News reporter who's been doing great on the ground reporting for the network in this election. And she said her opinion was that this cost the Republicans the election in Nevada, and that she's going to be writing about that in her columns in the coming days. And so I hope I didn't blow anything.
No.
But anyway, the point is that this is not just a problem for the Republicans in 2022. I think there are two things to look at. This is now going to become an unbelievable fight inside the Republican primary for president in 2023, inside the party and the discussions. But the other thing that I'm most interested in is, what do you do if you're John Roberts now? And that basically this extremism of this court has clearly blown back on the Republican Party in a major, major way, and could cause pain for election after election to come. What do all the 6 justices on the court now do? And do they look at Alito and say, dude, you had your wild ride in the park, you know, over the last 6 months, but no more of this crap. You know, we keep doing this, we're going to, you know, burn the Republican Party to the ground for 30 years, right? I think this is a huge warning to the Supreme Court that they've got to, like, you know, come back to their senses and do the right thing here for the American people.
I think the first check on that will be to see how they roll up on Clarence Thomas, because Clarence Thomas is in the midst of a shitstorm of problems that stem from his wife's involvement and the way he has postured himself on the court, particularly with respect to matters that have come before the court where he clearly should recuse himself. I think Justice Jackson Brown, Brown Jackson, saying that she would recuse herself from the Harvard.
Yep.
She clearly has set the bar, and now everybody's kind of looking at Clarence and going, "You next." And so I think there's a lot of validity to how you see the ripples from this election roll up on an institution like the Supreme Court, particularly given how we know Chief Justice Roberts feels about immersing his court in politics, immersing the court generally, but specifically his court in this quagmire of MAGA republicanism that has sunk the court to its lowest appreciation by the American people ever.
Yeah, and Michael, I'll just say two things. I think for you and the movement that you're part of, having Clarence Thomas step down and resign and having a Democrat be put on the court may be one of the most important things that your movement can try to do over the next 2 years, because then the power of the three that just got appointed by Mitch McConnell, will be limited, but Republicans will still have a majority, right? Yeah. I mean, John Roberts will still have a majority. The way that he can reclaim, control over the court and take it away from the extremists is by having Thomas step down and a Democrat being appointed. And so I think the other thing I wanted to say that I think is really another kind of major ripple or from the election that just happened is that, if Democrats had lost both chambers and there was sort of a red wave and we had been blown out, I think Merrick Garland's work would have become much more difficult. I think some of the legitimacy of his ability to let the wheels of justice turn on the insurrection and Donald Trump's theft of national secrets and all the things that he needs to do that are important for preserving our democracy, it would have been very, very hard. It would have just been politically much more challenging.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
So he now, I think, has, just more running room, frankly, to do what he thinks is best, to not let the level of attacks on him and his staff, the naming of his, just think about what would have happened, right? They would have outed every single prosecutor. They would have, there would have just been mayhem. I think that stuff now becomes much more difficult because part of the perception of what happened in this election is that Americans wanted to preserve their democracy, right? They wanted the the election denialists and all the stuff they have done with that. And so it creates now almost a mandate for Merrick Garland to go finish the job. And I'm really encouraged by that. And by the way, I hadn't really processed that beforehand about how important it was because we didn't know what was going to happen in this election. We had no idea how this was all going to go down. That's what's amazing about this process, right? I mean, we all have inklings and understandings and kind of hopes and fears, right? But this election came out in a way where there's just one of the clear absolute narratives is that Americans are fighting to preserve their democracy and that those that are trying to weaken it had a really bad day. And that's good for all of us, regardless of what party you're in.
I want to get into that after a quick break because it's sort of take a look back as we take a look forward, because you and I had a conversation in our last meeting in which we were kind of outliers of how this thing could play out.
Yeah.
I want to put our thoughts then up against the reality now, and we're going to have a little bit of fun with that when we come back with my buddy, my polling partner, my friend here, Simon Rosenberg. We'll be right back after this.
I call it the MAGA hangover. I think there was always downward pressure on the Republican brand. People were uncertain of them because of January 6th, all these things we've talked about. And so, it's very possible that this could be not just a close competitive election for Democrats, but we could actually have a good election. There is, let's say a third chance, or, if you scenario plan, 1/3 chance now that Democrats could win this election by 4 or 5 points, not just a point or two, right? And I think that certainly my view is that as we head towards the election, things are much more likely to get better for Democrats than they are to get better for Republicans.
All right, so there it is. Simon and I both on the record, 2-3 months out before the election, talking about how Democrats could actually wind up holding the House. That the ground was much more favorable towards Democrats than the national conversation, and certainly some of the polling that was being pushed around would tell you. So I want to pick up with that, Simon, because you and I were outliers over the course of the summer, and it's really one of the things we first connected on when I was following some of your tweets. I was like, wait a minute, time out, this brother's actually seeing what I'm saying, so I'm not crazy. I'm not out here by myself. Compared to that conversation that we had in September, where we talked about what the ground actually could look like, the possibility then of Democrats actually holding the House. And while with, again, the margins favorable to Republicans at this point, they're not going to have a massive majority. The most they'll have is a 12-seat majority in the House, with the 7 races still undecided, sitting at 222 at the moment. How have those results matched up with our thinking then, what we saw then? And was there anything that surprised you?
I actually think we've done better in this election than I thought we would, to be honest. I honestly, the results in Michigan, we flipped both chambers in Michigan. I had hoped for that, but I didn't think that was possible. We flipped the House.
Yeah, because we didn't really drill down on state races. We didn't statewide races and legislative races.
But Michael, one of the things we did talk about, and this is interesting now, is that, as the architect of the redistricting in 2010, the Republicans, that the unbelievable gerrymanders that came out of that has, kept, like, for example, today in Wisconsin, what we just learned is that Democrats won 51% of the statewide vote in Wisconsin in the state legislative races and got 30% of the seats.
Yeah.
And so I describe what's happened in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and North Carolina as laboratories of authoritarianism, right? Not laboratories of democracy. And we just saw 2 of those states that had these kind of impenetrable gerrymandered legislatures flip. We flipped Pennsylvania, we flipped Michigan. Now, why does that matter? Because one of the things we discussed also in that interview was that there was going to have to be some kind of grand coalition between the Democrats and your wing of the Republican Party to flip these legislatures to, irrevocably defeat MAGA, to shake the hold of MAGA over the Republican Party, and also to prevent this sort of freak state legislative theory that's kicking around, to prevent it from actually throwing the election to the presidential election to the Republicans in 2024, irregardless of the popular vote. That just got much harder because of us flipping the Michigan and Pennsylvania legislatures. And so I do think for the democracy warriors here, we needed to neutralize the extremism and the extreme gerrymanders in these states. There's 2 more states to go, by the way. It's Wisconsin and North Carolina.
Yeah, that's right.
Are the 2 other ones where there's extreme gerrymanders that are essentially preventing democracy from prevailing in those states. But 2 of the 4 that were most extreme were defeated this week. That's a big deal, because it just means particularly if Republicans win the House, the ability for them to sort of disregard the will of the people and let the state legislatures elect their own electors, right, in this sort of obscure theory, that now got very, very hard to do next time, and that's really important for the health of our democracy. And so that's again, that's because there is in some places this kind of super coalition that is developing between the traditional Democratic Party and Republicans who just don't want to be with MAGA. And whether we need to do that one more time in 2024, and whether this relationship that you and I, we need to figure out. I mean, look, your homework assignment, the thing we'll talk about in our next session, that you should be talking about openly on MSNBC and other places, is that the Democratic Party and all of you need to create some kind of more formal alliance. It can still be informal, but it needs to be more. There needs to be something more formal, I think, established here. We're all on the same team for now. We may not be in
Right.
6 years from now, and that's fine. I mean, we weren't for many years, but we have our work is not done, and we've got MAGA's wounded, but we gotta make MAGA go away. And I think that we've got the next 2 years. We have an opportunity to really excise MAGA out of the political system of the United States, to kill the virus that has infected your party. And I think I'm very encouraged by what happened in Michigan and Pennsylvania. That was not something that I anticipated, because as you may remember, Michael, in 2020, we actually really kind of underperformed in the state legislative races.
Yes.
And it was sort of a shock. We won by 4.5 points nationally, but we didn't really dent the Republican advantages in the state legislatures. So in this midterm election, this red wave election, Democrats had significant breakthroughs in these critical state legislatures. Is just an extraordinary part of what just happened. So I'm really encouraged about that as we look forward.
How does that then translate when you look at how we analyze the election, and literally I didn't have any big polling firms that I was associated with or working with. I talked to people. I looked at the numbers that were coming in, the polling that was publicly, and sort of shied away from the bullshit stuff and really kind of focused on, and then discovered Simon and found that alliance in that respect of saying, okay, this guy is seeing something that I think I'm seeing. And that connection worked because you made it real. You put skin on those bones, if you will, in a real sense. When you step back down and you're looking at this, and we know the level of polling that was put out on the street in the last few weeks by Republicans, sort of gaming the system with their polling. Yep. What did people get wrong in their predictions, do you think? How did both Democrats and Republicans show up differently than expected? Was it Republicans? I think you kind of made the point already that Republicans were like, yeah, I can't do the MAGA thing. I'm going to hold my nose and vote D, or I'm going to vote for, Governor Kemp, but I'm not going to vote for, Herschel Walker. I mean, how do you think that all came together?
Yeah. So, you and I discussed last time that I wrote a year ago, I was on Joe in late October of 2020.
I was going to bring that up. Yes. Yeah.
So Joe Trippi and I actually talked about this yesterday. I'd forgotten about the origin of this, but I went on Joe Trippi's podcast. Joe is one of my dear friends, and as you know, he works in the Lincoln Project. So he's also trying to create these connections between democracy warriors in both parties. And Joe and I were talking about the election, and I said, what's interesting, Joe, because what happened is that Biden's approval rating started really dropping in September and October, right? Mm-hmm. It had slowly started dropping after June, but then it really sort of accelerated. And my view is what happened was back to school happened, and sort of the chaos of COVID became thrown in everybody's face, and his approval rating continued to drop. And what I told Joe in an interview like this, we were just talking, and I said, Joe, what's really interesting is that Biden's approval rating has dropped like 10 points, but the congressional generic, the vote of Democrat Republican, hasn't moved, and it's actually still like +3 Democrat. And I said, it's possible that the disappointment in Biden is not carrying over to then embrace of Republicans,
right? Because
people could be disappointed in Biden and still not want to vote MAGA. I mean, the fear of MAGA was the thing that drove the last 2 elections in 2018 and 2020. And what I sort of speculated at that point was this decoupling, which we started talking about a lot over the summer, between Biden's approval rating and what was happening between the Democrats and Republicans, right? The explanation of that is that, people just voted against MAGA in vast numbers in the last 2 elections. We won those 2 elections by 6.5 points on average. Both were historic turnout. So more people had just voted against MAGA than any movement in American history. And then the Republicans embraced MAGA. And so that was like, well, why would you do that? Didn't everybody just vote against that, right? And so So what I speculated, or what I sort of wondered, was like, this is not going to be a typical midterm. The Republicans just did something really stupid.
Right.
They should have run away from MAGA instead of running towards it, right?
Right.
So what I wrote in that column that we discussed the last time, which I called "Why 2022 Will Not Be 2010,"
Like 2010. Yes.
is that I said three basic things, which have all proven to be true. I said, one is that Democrats are going to have a lot to run on and have accomplishments that we'll be able to sell. And I think we had enough, to sell.
Right.
That, you'd elected us, and we did a pretty good job, right? The second thing I said was that there will be things that happen in 2022 that will remind voters why they were scared of MAGA, right? And I said, well, and that's what happened. And then the third thing, and this is really important in my analysis, was that we had advanced dramatically in our tools for doing GOTV, that we had developed during COVID far more sophisticated tools to reach voters, and that the midterm drop-off problem was far less likely, right? All three of those things actually happened, right? And I wrote that column November 1st, 2021. I mean, what happened on the third piece, which we haven't discussed, and that people I think don't really understand, is the Democratic Party was never an early vote party. Your party was.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
I've been trying to tell these numbnuts that for the last 4 years.
We always had, mail ballot envy against the way, in part, Karl Rove did that, right?
That was our whole micro-targeting process. That's what that was all about.
I know, we had total envy of it. Look, your party, we're still a TV ad party. Karl Rove changed your party a long time ago to make it a mail party, a data. We didn't have a national voter file up until a few years ago. You guys had a national voter file 30 years ago, 25 years ago, whatever it was, right? Yeah. So you were much more of a one-to-one party than we were, and you always crushed us on the mail vote and the early vote. And in listen to the difference. In 2018, we won the early vote by 3 points. And we won it by 11 points this time, right? And so what happened? We embraced the early vote. We have never run the kind of early vote operation. The DNC spent close to $75 million building early vote operations to push our prime voters to vote early and to allow then the GOTV operation to go get the lower propensity voters, to get them to turn out. And why does that matter? In a midterm election where you have far greater numbers of irregular voters, you're not sure they're going to turn out, you want to get into reaching those lower propensity voters as fast as possible. So we had a massive tactical advantage on the GOTV over the Republicans, who focused their election day operation on election day.
And that's because I was going to say that's because we allowed some fool who doesn't even know what an election looks like tell us, oh no, early voting is fraudulent. Oh no, vote by mail. I'm sitting there, Simon, and I'm repeatedly saying on national air, so the Republicans can hear it. How do you think we won in 2010?
I know.
You think I just left all of our elderly who are sitting in senior citizens' homes without access to the ballot box because they could not go to the polls same day? No, we got them their ballot.
No. I mean, look, this was we basically, what was so incredible, and I've been writing about this, and by the way, the Washington Post on Monday, had the story about this in Arizona, about how the Republicans basically, at the beginning of last week in Arizona, are like, no, we want everybody to go vote early. We were wrong, and you had the crazy election denialist, Republican Party chair in Arizona doing all these pictures of her voting early, like, hey, voting early is really cool, right? As if putting it into the memory hole, right? And so the reason I raised this is that what I wrote a year ago, was that here's what I said: look, what may happen in this election is the Republicans may underperform expectations because of the MAGA hangover. Democrats have a stronger agenda to run on than usual, and we were going to beat them on election day and in GOTV. And all three of those things happened. And so it's why I think I was open to seeing data over the last year that wasn't confirming my priors, that wasn't starting with red wave and then working. Because if you believed in the red wave last spring, you were looking at a different election than we were actually in.
Right.
And what happened is that a lot of people, including a lot of people who get paid a lot of money to analyze elections and are professionals, right? They bought into the red wave narrative and they never really let go of it. And because of that, I think they were unable to see and understand data that wasn't confirming their assumption about the election. Whereas I had a different orientation, which is I didn't think there was ever going to be a red wave. And so I think I was more open, Michael, to seeing data that told a different story than many of the people who were starting with this red wave, frame on the election.
What does that tell you about two things? One, what actually drew people to the polls? Was it, because I don't think in absolute terms it was the revelation that, oh, I'm actually afraid of MAGA. And therefore, I think some people still went in with this idea of the election being around a principle or policy that they supported. But I think also at the same time, and I'd be curious about your theory on this, is while I'm driven because inflation is X and gas prices are Y, I also have this thing in my head that says, yeah, but democracy is important too.
Yeah.
And the second piece is, what did the exit polling say to you about, which we'll get into next, how we set ourselves up after these midterms going into 2024?
So I think what you're saying is really, really important. And I think that the way that I'd like to talk about, I use MAGA as a shorthand, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because we're all in the political business. But I think that the way this manifests with everyday people is that there's just something wrong with the Republican Party. They've just gone too far.
Right.
I think that however people got there, whether it was abortion, whether it was the voting, the election denialism, whether it was, trying to strip everybody of health care or climate denialism, like whatever your way into, these guys have gone a little bit crazy. I think this was the third election in a row where that may have been the driving out, force of the election.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was that abortion became, for many people, the sense of like, oh, this is just, they've gone too far.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it doesn't even mean that they had to agree.
Right.
Right. It's like, man, what happened to my party?
Right.
I mean, and I kept, wondering about older Reagan Republicans who grew up, who were Cold Warriors. And, when Russia intervened in the election a month ago and raised gas prices in the United States to hurt the Democrats, and Republicans cheered, and Kevin McCarthy cheered what Russia was doing to raise the gas prices of everyday Americans, right? I think if you're a Cold Warrior, I always believed that there was some segment of older Republicans who were looking at this Russia Trump stuff as being like, what is that?
Right.
I mean, isn't like the central achievement of the modern Republican Party breaking up, being the ones who really broke up communism and ended the Cold War? I mean, that's the central achievement of Reagan and Bush, and arguably the most central achievement of the Republican Party, arguably in the last 70 or 80 years. And now Donald Trump and his buddies are like, hanging with Putin. I mean, I always believe that somehow for some group of older Republicans who were still Reaganites, that stuff just was like a bridge too far,
You're absolutely. I can just real quick confirm your assessment there. That's exactly what a lot of us heard, that we were trying to get the party to focus in on in various levels, in various ways. It is the embodiment of what Liz Cheney was trying to say to the, not just through her work on January 6th, but when she went out and did finally, which was hard for her to do. I mean, you thought it was hard for me as national chairman to cross that Rubicon. For Liz to go out and actually campaign for Democrats goes to the heart of the point you raise.
I agree with you. I mean, she ran $500,000 worth of ads in Arizona. I mean, if we end up winning that Senate race by 2 points, I mean, of course that stuff made a huge difference. Of course, it made a difference that she went into Michigan and campaigned. I mean, Liz Cheney has been a hero, and you've been a hero, and frankly, all of you. I mean, as somebody who works in politics, I don't think people really understand. I think about this all the time when I talk to Bill Kristol. You know, I was like, I don't know that I would have had the fortitude and courage to do what you guys have done. I mean, truly, I mean, and to stay in it as opposed to just going off and doing something else with your life, right? You know, which would have been the easy way out.
Which I'm reminded of a lot. Why don't you go do something else?
I'm sure you have. And so I think that, you know, part of the reason part of this victory for democracy is because of you, and because of Bill, and because of Liz, and because of Matthew Dowd, and because of Joe Scarborough, and all of you who've stuck with it, who didn't just recede and go back to a normal life, right? I mean, it would have been very easy for you to say, I'm going to go make money for a few years and get out of this crazy game. And hopefully my party will somehow all by itself come back to being the way it was. But you stayed in it. And I'm here in part to salute you, Michael, to be honest.
I appreciate that.
And the courage that you've demonstrated, and your openness of mind too. And I think that's also a sign of maturity. This business is always full of surprises. Every election is unique and a new election. I mean, this is a big, complicated country with so many diverse people and parts of the country. We're 300 million plus. Of course, it's going to be all new all over again. And I think that the other thing that caught commentators was this sort of lazy and facile thing that, oh, this is like 2010 or 2014. No election is like any other election. And I think one of the reasons that Tom Bonnier and I and you and Joe Trippi and others is that we stayed close to the data about this election. And we didn't come to this election with an opinion. We tried to understand, and that's in part a sign of maturity, by the way. I've just been doing this a long time. I've learned the hard way, right? That if you're not staying close to the data, you can get your ass,
very quickly.
Right? And I've been on the losing side of some very tough blowout elections in recent years. And so, but I've been on the winning side of elections too. I mean, I helped create the winning 2018, flip the house strategy for the Democrats. So I was in the game recently, not just a long time ago. And that was the first blow to MAGA. That victory in the House in 2018 was our first, because we didn't get it done in the Senate. We didn't do well in the state legislatures. We were the first ones to really strike a blow at MAGA. And I'm really proud of that, frankly, for the work. And one of the reasons I did it is for the exact reason, which is that I was concerned about my country. And what's important to me also is that many of the people we recruited in 2018, the patriots that came forward, like Abby Spanberger and Alyssa Slotkin, Liz Cheney's sisters, her sisters that she went out and campaigned for, many of them have survived. And it's really important because I will tell you, those people that got elected in 2018 on the Democratic side reminded me a lot of the 1946 class that was elected to the Congress. People who had fought in World War II, who understood that the fight that was in front of us against totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and they came to Washington to make sure that we finished that job.
Right.
And that class in 1946 created the space for kind of the muscular liberalism that we saw develop in the United States through Truman and Eisenhower, that ended up where Reagan ended up and Bush ended up finishing the job 40 years later. This group that got elected in 2018, to me, felt a lot like that group.
Interesting.
And what's importantly is that almost all of them, I think at this point, and we'll see, have survived, which is important for our country and our democracy and our future, because these are the best members of Congress that I've ever worked with in the 30 years I've been doing this. And that's why Liz went out there and fought for them, because she understood how important they were,
Yeah, knowing her as I do, I have to admit, I was shocked when she announced that she was going to actually campaign. I know the phone calls I got when I decided to actively go out and endorse Joe Biden and to do video and to, declaratively state that I wanted him to be my president for the country. The people were like, you're the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. And I know she got a lot of that. You are currently sitting member of the Republican Party, who your daddy is? Your daddy is Dick Cheney. But that sense of principled leadership is an element of this campaign that I think was underrated and not really accounted for by the media. I'm going to have a conversation in the next week or so on the media and how they, in my view, got so much of this election wrong, because it was so easy to play the narrative that, particularly galling in the last few weeks, putting out and giving legitimacy to bogus bullshit polls that they knew were both bogus and bullshit, and elevating them up into the political ether in a way that disoriented voters, and really fed the MAGA lie that, oh, the fix is in, or there are going to be problems, and if there are, this is why. How do those lessons learned from this cycle inform how you begin to look at the impact on 2024 and what 2024 looks like? And I really hate pivoting to the next election while the recent one is still fresh, but there's a through line starting with 2018 right through now that will take us to 2024.
Listen, I think that this is in some ways the most important thing we're talking about today, right? Is that the degradation of the media environment in the United States and the sort of the flooding of the zone of, the Republicans can take this issue like fentanyl, right? Because of Fox News and their noise machine, and turn this ridiculous argument about fentanyl and Halloween candy and turn it into a national thing. And of course it doesn't happen, and then everybody moves on and forgets, right? I think we're in, to me, the biggest crisis in this country is the fact that is the loudness of and the craziness of the right-wing noise machine, driven primarily by an immigrant to this country, Rupert Murdoch. And I think that we now need to come to, we are in a dangerous place because the Democratic Party doesn't have a noise machine to compete. We haven't gone out and built this. And I think the Republican noise machine is getting more powerful, more deranged, more networked, more amplified, louder, and it's crushing and overwhelming, I think, traditional journalism. And I just want to say, as a former journalist, I worked for ABC News out of college, and I spent years working the TV news business before I went into politics. I think the journalism failure of the last few months has been the greatest that I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I was on calls with many, many of the most important people that you read and see on TV, showing them the data and having people laugh at me, right? I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm a credible guy. Like, I'm not always right, but I'm not some crazy dude, right? And, there are stories that I tried to get reporters to write on. For example, the story that the Hispanic vote wasn't fleeing into Republican arms, which has now been confirmed by what happened on Tuesday night, right? I couldn't get a single story, even though I introduced bilingual polling to the Democratic Party 20 years ago. I invented the Democratic Party's Hispanic strategy. I produced the first Spanish language ads ever run by Democrats in Arizona, Florida, Nevada, New Mexico, right? And Colorado. I didn't get a single story showing contradictory data that they were wrong about the Hispanic goes Republican narrative. And I spoke to probably 20 reporters about it last 6 months. And they just said, no, like, you're wrong. It's a red wave. It's Hispanics are fleeing the Republican, the Democratic Party. I was like, actually not, right? Can I show you what's happening? And so not really. Yeah, not really. So it's one of the reasons why the election results that just happened are so remarkable, because basically for most of the last 6 months, what voters in the United States were told was that the Democrats are toast, they're weak, they're getting rolled, and that all this craziness you see in the Republican Party, it's not really there. They're just, this is, the Jedi mind trick of like the normalization of their nuttiness, right? Became, what I call the normalization bias in the media, sort of discounting the fact that, for example, Donald Trump stole, potentially, that Donald Trump's the greatest criminal in American history and stole secrets. None of that it all got normalized, right? It all got reduced to sort of he said, she said stuff. And I think that despite all that, and maybe because of that, right? Because I'm now wondering whether or not the declaration of the red wave may have actually driven up Democratic turnout in the last couple of weeks.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was watching late night after I got back from New York late last night, and of course, at that point you're like, okay, since I'm up, I tuned in to MSNBC, and there was an interesting conversation that Chris Hayes was having with the panel on at that hour, and he raised that point. He raised the question of just how much of this was this sort of less red wave and more red scare. And Elie Mystal took the ball and ran with it and said absolutely that a big chunk of this, it was used to scare the Democratic base, that there was this big red wave coming and that they should get out and vote. That is a tool in politics. We know to sort of better words, I'm sure, but the accurate one, I think, is to manipulate the perception that people have about what's about to come. We saw that with Donald Trump and speaking to white suburban women in the 2020 cycle about they're going to put Section 8 housing in your neighborhood. And in 2018, it was, guess what? The caravans coming up from the border to Iowa, suburban Iowa.
Right.
So
they're coming to get you.
Yeah.
So let me just, I think this is I'm going to try to do this really quickly because I could talk about this for a long time, but and I'm not good at talking things shortly, as you've noticed, but it's not one of my great skills, but I think this is a really, I don't know that what I'm about to say, I don't know if I believe it yet, but I'm just going to sort of throw it out there.
Okay.
Is that what we saw?
This is a thought bubble for everybody listening. It's a thought bubble.
It's a sketch, right? Like we're playing around there, whiteboarding stuff, right? Last week, when the red wave talk kind of exploded, right? On Tuesday, Wednesday, there became a declaration by the national media that the red wave had arrived, even though there was actually no data backing that up. Democratic turnout started increasing in the early vote. And what we saw during the last week was, in the final week of the election, is the early vote got 3 points more Democratic as the week went on. And actually in some states like Texas and in Arizona and in Washington, and in North Carolina, the vote went up by a lot. It grew, it got much more Democratic. Some of that may have been just the Democratic field operation kicking in, right? But also some of that, I think, was just people were listening to the media, the declaration that there was an imminent MAGA takeover of the country, that it was Democrats. And I think it's possible that this Republican ploy to invent the red wave could have backfired on them in this election.
Yeah.
And I don't know that. I don't know that we'll ever know that, right? I don't know that that's a knowable thing, but I will say this, what I have now come to believe, and you and I, we haven't talked about this, but the flooding of the zone with all these Republican polls in the battleground states and also in the national thing. The question is, why would you do that? Right? You and I, and I know you went on Joy Reid's show on Friday night and talked about this. It's in part because Republicans have played fast and loose with polling for a long time. We know that. I mean, but in the past, it would be, the last month of an election would be, 3 media polls in a state, 1 Democratic poll and two Republican polls. This time, 70-80% of all the polls in the 7 battleground states in the last month were Republican pollsters. I did a calculation of this, is there were at least 10 different polling shops producing more than 40 polls in these 7 states. And in some states, there were 8 or 9 polls being dropped in a 3-day period by pollsters. My favorite was this poll. Joy talked about this on her show last week. My favorite was this Amber Integrated, a firm I had never heard of. It was an all-white firm from Oklahoma City. They had all-white staff. They put them all up there, was dropping polls in Georgia, right, on 2 days before the election.
Right.
like, what in the world was that, right? Like, what experience, And so what happened was that I became now convinced, and this is going to be one of the most interesting stories of the election. Did their attempt to create the red wave, was it done because they knew they were going to have turnout problems? That they knew that there was an enthusiasm gap, and that because it was a massive campaign, Michael. I mean, one of the things that you have to think about as you develop your opinion about this, I think this was more than just LOLs and kind of screwing around with the system. I think it's possible that they were panicking about this data that I was seeing, the data that in their own, the early vote was not going well for them, right? And which we saw that they acknowledged in Arizona and started adjusting their campaign strategy. And so the question is, did they do this because they did this to create this inevitability to suppress our turnout and to grow their turnout, because the Republicans should actually feel like they were winning, right?
Well,
so we'll see. I mean, I don't know.
I can backfill a little bit of that based on chatter conversations leading up to this, which is why I was so animated about this, because I was so annoyed with some of the thinking and how this was playing itself out. I think your instincts on this are right, if not on the bullseye, is right on that line of the bullseye, because there was a lot of private polling that, their internal polling that they were doing that was beginning to show that the enthusiasm gap was less with the Democrats than it was with the Republicans. I mean, in other words, Republicans are having their own kind of form of it, depending on where you were in the country and where the races were. So that you can't single shot this. You just can't say the Republicans over here, there's a red wave coming, and not say it over here. All right. Although,
this is really important what you just said. I agree with you 100%. Right.
Right. You cannot do that. And so the reality of it was you had to go all in. You had to go full MAGA. Right. So you had this conscious sweep that we're going to drive it up everywhere, because the thinking, and this is where, if you're looking at this linearly, you're going to say, well, Democrats, given the history and the tradition and the projections and Biden's numbers, they're depressed as hell. They're not going to turn out. But what their numbers were showing was that depression wasn't that deep. And as we already discussed, there was a bifurcation. Biden's personal polling numbers were not translated one for how they felt about the Congress, how they felt about governor's races, how they felt about senatorial races. They had made the separation. I was saying that over the summer. You and I talked about it.
At length.
At length in September. You and I saw it. I'm like, why aren't these mofos seeing the same thing? And the reason they saw it, their response to it was pushing out these BS polls.
Yeah, no, they saw it, and I think that this is what's important about this, is that what it meant to me, because I really was shocked at the scale and scope of what the Republicans did, this flooding the zone and gaming the averages. Nothing like this has ever happened before. I mean, the scale of this was massive, and it was a bunch of silly pollsters too. Like, there was no way to look at this and view this as a credible thing, right? It was just an obvious, like, ridiculously crude ploy to sort of make the election feel better than it actually was, right? And the question is, why would you do that? And the answer was because what you were seeing in your own data was looking a lot more like New York 19 than it was the bullshit that was showing up on MSNBC, right?
Exactly.
And so I want to go back to this really basic point. I think that what happened in this election, you asked me what happened, in the media coverage, everyone was really kind of freaked out by what happened in 2020, right? There was this shy Trump voter, whatever it was. So all the polling, even in our polling, like, was 3 to 4 points more Republican than we all expected. And everyone kind of there was this haunting of the entire political commentariat around the missing of the shy Trump voters in 2020. People should have been equally concerned about missing the Democratic vote in those 5 House specials in Kansas, which was, by the way, in this election, not
Right.
in the last election,
Right.
right? And
Right.
because what happened in all those was, and I will tell you, one of the most graphic examples of this was the New York 19 race, which we didn't even try to win that race because it was a race where it was being redistricted, and so everyone was going to end up in different districts. And so the DCCC, to conserve money, just like what happened in the Maya Flores special down in Texas, didn't compete because it didn't matter. And I think that I argued with them that I thought that was wrong because the media narrative does matter and that's worth money.
Thank you.
So if you do $2 million to defeat Maya Flores, you can save $15 million of stupid media coverage of Republicans declaring the Hispanics are fleeing the Democratic Party. But they made that choice. This was a choice. This was not stupidity. This was a decision, right?
Right.
And frankly, it may actually have looked really smart now in retrospect because we won in New York 19 and Maya Flores got crushed in her race in Texas, right?
Yep.
So what I want to say, though, I want to be very clear about what I'm about to say. So New York 19, which was just a few months ago, right? It wasn't 2 years ago. Every Republican commentator and the NRCC and the RNC was going to every media reporter and saying, this is a slam dunk. We're going to steal this seat. This is a sign of a red wave. They're toast, right? I talked to the DCCC on election day at like 3 o'clock, and they said, our latest track had us down 3 to 4. We're okay with that because we didn't spend any money, right? So like, we'll take the 3 to 4 point loss. We didn't spend the $5 million to get us up to win the election. Let them do that. We don't really care. And we won by 2.5 points in a race that we didn't spend any money in, right? And if that wasn't a sign that there was a blue wave or blue overperformance, and how everyone kind of forgot that happened, this is what I said at the very beginning of the show, which is that this sort of what went into the memory hole was all of these all these signals that Democrats were overperforming expectations. And what went into the memory hole of the red wave memory hole was that Republicans were underperforming. The Republicans knew that they were struggling with turnout. You could see it in the early vote.
Yeah.
And so what they did is they gaslighted this red wave thing, I think, as a tactical way to try to win the election. What's so disappointing is that so many analysts and people in the media bought it. And that's what I said when I went on Joy Reid last week, which kind of kicked up a lot of dirt, frankly.
Oh, it did. It did. I loved it.
Yeah, in the family, which is that it's one thing for Republicans to gaslight. It's another thing for professionals who know better to be bamboozled by it, right? And that's where it's where I remain deeply disappointed with many people who I've been working with for a long time, who should have realized that the party of the big lie was capable of lying about elections. They lied about the last one, and they lied about this one too. And why people didn't have more of a bullshit detector on this, I don't really understand, to be honest.
Yeah, it's going to be something that is going to require, particularly as we get ready for the next cycle, some reevaluation of how we talk about these things and when we start talking about them.
Agreed.
Because I think the sooner we burst that bubble before it even starts to inflate and starts to collect air and rise, we kill it. Because I just learned, and for me, the turning point where I knew the Republican Party was in trouble boils down to one state in one moment in time, and her name was Kansas.
Yep.
And that for me was when I started looking at this election very different, because you do not take a state like Kansas and lose on a proposition related to abortion unless you're losing your voters.
20%. They lost by 20 points.
20%. That's right.
And the National Party didn't spend any money there, right? I mean, that money was locally raised. There was an organic organization that grew up there. So yeah, no, look, Michael, it's a wild, look, this is an amazing country. We're all blessed to be here. I am so proud of the heroes of this election are the American people.
Yeah.
And the anti-MAGA majority that showed up in such massive numbers in the last 2 elections, they showed up again. The proud patriots in this country, fought to prevent the takeover despite COVID and supply chain issues and high inflation and Russia creating global inflation. I mean, all these things that plagued our politics over the last couple of years, the incredible, uncommon common sense of the common sense of the uncommon good sense of the common people, I think was Jefferson's line, right? I'm getting it wrong, but whatever that line was, it showed up again. And thank God, right? And that at the strength and resilience and patriotism and love of country that was exhibited by Americans over the last few weeks, we are all lucky to be in this together. I look forward to continuing this fight with you, Michael.
Yeah, same here.
We still have work to do. We had a good day, but the battle, we won this battle, but we got more coming.
There's more to the war than folks may want to appreciate, but I'm glad you appreciate it. It has been a real treat for me to get to know you and to work with you in sort of, and just sort of learning from reading what you're putting out there, how to look at the information. It's there. You make it readily available. You make it very clear. You break it down. And so, folks, I really highly recommend, if you want to start tracking, even now as we get ramped up for the next cycle, if you want to go back and sort of decouple what happened in this cycle, check out Simon's work on Twitter at SimonWDC. Go to the New Democrat Network website. Check it out and learn for yourself before you intake the information just whole, right? And digest it differently, because, like I said, for me, the bulb went on when I saw the results from Kansas, and I went, we're not in Kansas anymore.
There's no question.
Simon Rosenberg.
Thank you so much, Mr.
It's a
Chairman.
real treat having you on, my friend. Thank you so much. And I look forward to our next conversation as always.
Thank you.
All right. That does it for this time together, folks. I appreciate you so much. If you like the podcast, tell a friend, share it, give us a review on Apple Podcasts. I know that's hard to do. No, it ain't. Just do it. You love me, right? Come on, help a brother out. Follow me on Twitter at Michael Steele. Follow the podcast at Steele_podcast. Check out the good work of Simon Rosenberg at Simon WDC. Simon Rosenberg, president of NDN, the New Democrat Network, and the New Policy Institute. Good work all around. Until next time, God bless, be safe. Holidays are coming. All right. See you soon.